Okay, calm down. You got nervous, man. You got nervous, man. Okay, calm down.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Katie Halper Show. I'm very excited to be here with you guys tonight, and I'm so excited to be joined by Briahna Joy Gray. We have so much to talk about. We're also going to be joined during the second half of the show by Marc Lamont. But before we start, I just want to remind everyone to please like this stream, give it a thumbs up. Also, please hit subscribe, and then press the bell. And if you can, please be a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. We had a great Patreon-only extended discussion with John Mearsheimer for last week. So I'm going to bring on Briahna Joy Gray. And as people probably know, Briahna Joy Gray is the host of the Bad Faith podcast. She was a press secretary for Bernie Sanders. She was also a politics editor at The Intercept. And she was recently fired by The Hill for the show Rising over her criticisms of Israel. And we're going to get into what exactly happened there. So without any further ado, welcome, Brie.
Thank you, Katie. I've been really looking forward to this since you're one of the few people in the world who can really commiserate with me from a personal place.
Right. It's true. So for people who don't know, I was fired by The Hill show Rising for a monologue that I wrote laying out why Israel was an apartheid state. And then later on, Brie, who had been there much longer than I had and was a full-time host, was also fired. We're actually going to take a look at the interview that you were fired over. So
ostensibly, remember, I think it is important to note that no one who works at The Hill has ever said a single word to me about my firing. During my day off, regularly scheduled day off, I simply received an email that I posted on Twitter so everyone can read it. I didn't say anything about why I was fired. I called my producer several times that day just to get some clarification about when my last day really was before I posted to the internet. I texted her, I emailed, and to date have not heard a word from anybody who actually works at The Hill except for Robbie and my very kind makeup artist. So who knows actually what the actual reason was. Yeah, that's right.
Oh, nice, Diana. See, another thing more history that we share, having sat in the chair myself and had my makeup done by Diana. Hi, Diana, if you're watching. This is a good question from John. Tell us where we stand on the Broadly Speaking with Brie and Katie show. It would be like a superhero team up. It's true. One of the things we did at The Hill on Rising was we did a pilot for a show we want to do with you and me, Rania Kalik and Abby Martin. And of course, that was not possible after they fired me. But now the world is our oyster, Briahna Joy Gray. So who knows what the future holds? But let's show a clip. And by the way, shout out to your producer for misspelling your name in the email you received.
Well, again, that wasn't from my producer. I'm not sure who that woman is. Maybe it seems like she's maybe in an HR capacity. Never interacted with that person before in my life. It was truly very impersonal. Nice. And I think it's relevant to note that because there's a sort of plausible deniability that The Hill gets to have around why they actually fired me by avoiding having any confrontation with, I don't mean confrontation, but any interaction with me at all. So the internet gets to decide why it was that I was fired versus, what I believe from not just that day, but my subjective experience of months and months of what it's been like working at The Hill, particularly after October 7th.
Right. And Briahna Joy Gray very bravely defended me after I was fired. We'll cut this in later. But you said that you had been told by the management at Rising that I was fired not over ideological reasons, but stylistic ones. And you said on the air, on your broadcast, on The Hill, on the Rising show, you said that if it's true that it's not for ideology, but it was just for stylistic reasons, well, I'm going to test that by talking about Israel. And you certainly were given ample opportunity with October 7th. And I think it's fair to say that they failed that test, but you guys can be the judge. So let's take a look at this clip from an interview you did with a hostage's sister. And this was on your last day at The Hill.
I think it was actually my second day.
Oh, second to last day. Okay.
The world won't help us. We will see 9/11 the second time in the US as well. But we can already see in the United States, in Michigan, rallies that calling death to America, not condemning terror organizations in Israel or any other place, in fact, is reflecting to your country as well.
I'm just going to push back against the implication that in Michigan, which has the largest Muslim and Arab population in America, that there is any threat of terrorism from our own people. And I would like to clarify also that one of the rationale that was presented for 9/11 was discussed with America's support of Israel's continued occupation of Palestine. So that's neither here nor there. I really do hope that Netanyahu agrees and Israel agrees to the ceasefire deal that could bring all the hostages, including your sister, home. And I'm sure many people watching are praying for her safety.
Thank you. Me too. And I really hope that you specifically will believe women when they say that they got hurt.
All right. Thanks for joining. Stick around. More Rising coming up next.
So, Brie, explain to us what the eye roll was for.
Yeah, I had a conversation with my producer about how I expected this interview to go. I never said no to interviews. I think there's value in talking to everyone, including the family member of hostages. Katie, as you know, you've interviewed kind of a really compelling interview with the son, I believe, of two Israelis who were killed on October 7th. Mm-hmm. That was a really compelling and useful interview. And I certainly had never in the history of the show and would never shy away from those kind of interviews. I will say that the same was not true about guests that I wanted to have on from the left's ideological perspective, but we'll get back to that later. But the way that this guest was described to me made it clear that she had put herself forward as an interview subject, which made me immediately skeptical, because the typical way that guests are booked on the show is that we reach out to guests that are interesting to us. That's the producer's function, to produce a show, not to necessarily take kind of volunteers from a crowd, especially given that we have had a long history on the show. This was the third instance of a pro-Zionist guest coming on specifically to try to litigate what they felt were my personal opinions about what I've tweeted or what I've expressed about the humanitarian offenses that are happening in Gaza, as opposed to the subject of the interview, which in this case, I tried very hard to keep it focused on the state of her sister and the other hostages, and either talking just kind of interpersonally about her sister, why she's loved and why she wants her home, or to the extent that the guest opened the door to it, what she thinks about Israel's prioritization or failure to prioritize getting hostages home, which is, of course, the subject of enormous protests that we saw just this past weekend. Unfortunately, what I anticipated would happen and what I warned my producer would happen and cautioned her against as she pushed this guest on me was that she made it personal. And here's how I knew it was going to be personal. The way it was framed to me was, this guest wants to come on and talk to you. Now, Katie, as you know, this is a show that I co-host with Robbie. It wasn't framed as, this guest wants to come on Rising. This guest wants to tell her story on Rising. This guest wants to talk to you and Robbie on Rising. No, specifically, the producer slacked to me and said, this guest wants to come on and talk to you, which to me was a clear sign that she wanted to be personally confrontational with me, as opposed to keeping the focus on her own sister. And when she did that at the very end of the interview, I was exasperated because I felt like my producer, Joanne Levine, had declined to protect me when this had happened in the past with other pro-Zionist guests. They use it as an opportunity to clip it and do a social media pile-on, attacking me across socials, clogging up my feed, very much personalizing it, right, to advance their own kind of Hasbara agenda. And I would prefer not to be used as a tool in that way. The production team didn't seem to have, or I should say my producer specifically, Joanne Levine, didn't seem to have any interest in protecting me from that eventuality. There was never any commentary about the mountain of racist and sexist tweets and memes that were made about me after each of those other instances that this had happened. And frankly, it was a sort of a hostile environment that I was continually put in because the show prioritized scapegoating me overprotecting their own hosts. And when the predictable happened, I exasperatedly glanced for a fraction of a second off into the corner of the screen before ending the interview, before the guest could continue to personalize it.
Right. Now, in terms of the actual content of what she was saying, right, there's also that aspect of it, which is perhaps eye roll justifiable. The idea that you don't believe women. I mean, you've done excellent radars on the weaponization of a narrative of sexual violence that's been used to, I would say, and you've said this, justify the genocide in Gaza, right? We all know
right.
the history of atrocity propaganda. You know, Saddam Hussein pulling babies out of incubators was one lie that was perpetuated. Gaddafi giving Viagra to his troops was another one. So what do you have to say about the actual content of what she was saying, which is that you somehow don't believe women?
Well, earlier in the interview, and I really do encourage people to watch the whole interview because it was long. We let it go longer than usual because I think it is important to hear from someone like her. And the irony of kind of turning into a cry bully scenario after there was a lot of grace demonstrated in the context of that interview, I think is particularly disappointing. But at one point in the interview, she brought up not just the mass rape hoax, but specifically the ultra religious group Zaka that was at the root of many of the core stories, narratives that were later debunked about sexual violence on October 7th. Narratives that have been debunked roundly by both the American and the Israeli press. And so when she specifically said, haven't you heard of Zaka? I was forced to push back at that point as well and saying, yes, I have heard of Zaka. And you might not be aware of this, but those reports have been roundly discredited and they are in fact not true. This is not an issue of believing women. There has yet to be a single woman that has materialized from October 7th who is making a claim about sexual assault. And in fact, as we now know from innumerable reports, including the latest UN investigation, hundreds and thousands of pieces of documentary evidence, visual evidence, photographs, and videos have been reviewed now in an investigatory capacity by the UN. And none of that imagery shows sexual assaults happening on October 7th. Now, there have been reports about a hostage describing sexual assault as a hostage, and I have no issue with that. I don't doubt the credibility of that at all, and her claim should be heard. But this woman, this guest, was making specific claims that had already been factually, roundly debunked by people across the ideological spectrum. And that is what she meant by believe women, believe roundly debunked lies. And I don't think it's my role as a journalist and the host of a show to let that kind of misinformation, for lack of a better word, stand unchallenged.
Right. And just to be clear, I mean, I asked you about this particular exchange, but this is something we hear from many defenders of Israel, believe women. And if you just point to the fact that there actually isn't forensic evidence of the allegedly systematic weaponization of rape, you're accused of being a rape denier. I actually wanted to show a clip of you talking about Sheryl Sandberg's recent documentary on this subject, because again, you did some excellent radars. Radars are what Rising calls monologues. You did some excellent monologues on this. And let's take a look at you breaking down some of Sheryl Sandberg's claims, as well as kind of just Zionist propaganda's claims about what happened on October 7th.
About October 7th, including several that Sandberg includes in her documentary. The UN report said it could not verify allegations of objects found inserted in female genital organs and explained that there had been, quote, erroneous interpretations of the state of bodies by some volunteer first responders without relevant qualifications and expertise, including mischaracterizing grazing gunshot wounds to genitalia as targeted genital mutilation using knives. Moreover, Pramila Paten's UN report also noted that it did not meet with any survivor or victim of sexual violence from October 7th, despite concerted efforts encouraging them to come forward, not because they weren't alive, but because they were not made available. In her documentary, Sandberg views the alleged pictures of sexual disfigurement and reacts on camera, but chose not to show them, she says, out of respect for the families. Now let's take a look at a clip of her doing exactly that in her documentary.
This is the body with the nails and the parts. When we get closer and closer, you can see the nails.
Oh my God.
אין שתי אופציות של מה שהם עשו.
This is a piece of metal stuck barrels.
אנחנו מצאנו אותה עם מכנסיים ותחתונים
This is
למטה.
not connected to the body.
זאת אישה שלקחו סכין ותקעו מלמטה, שכחו החוצה.
Oh my God.
But here's what the UN investigator said about claims that objects, including knives, were inserted into women's genitals.
And 2 of the cases that were reported were found to be unfounded.
In fact, I just want to add, there's a third one, Chloe, where there was an allegation that there were objects like knives inserted in the genitalia of a woman. I mean, the team reviewed the photos and we did not find anything like that. And I did mention, like, one of the challenges faced by, of course, by the Israeli government, but which impacted our own work, was the fact that inaccurate, unreliable forensic conclusions were drawn by untrained volunteer first responders. And we give some examples. We give some examples in the report, such as interpreting an anal dilation as anal penetration, when, according to our forensic expert, we've extensive burn damage. This is what you get, anal dilation, and the position of the body as a result of severe burn damage, again interpreted as being sexual violence.
So that
and I think
I think
it's worth noting. If I remember correctly, it's been a while since I watched the full interview. There was a point at my interview with the hostage's sister where she also talked about having seen these kind of images, and then went on to say that, to try to evoke the idea that her sister, who she has had no contact with, regrettably, since she was taken hostage, must be or was likely the victim of rape at all. And I didn't even get into that with the sister, but there have been very few to almost none instances of hostages being returned who report sexual assault. And so the presumption that she seemed to want to make was not only that these Zaka reports were real, that there are these images that people are claiming to see that have shown sexual assault, but also that her sister must have been, I guess, because of the nature of Palestinians or the nature of Hamas in particular, despite there being kind of a history of evidence of this, have been the victim of assault too. And she became very emotional when she was describing this kind of fictive assault, from what we know so far of her sister. And that was a part of why the interview started to become so long and became pretty emotional long before that final clip that has been viewed so many times.
Right. It's also worth mentioning that after you were let go, there was a report done by the Times of London, which is hardly a left-wing publication, which really quite thoroughly debunked the claims of evidence. In fact, they hired like a dark web investigator to look for any images that had been deleted, and they found none. And again, you hear people consistently talk about the video footage. We know that they raped them because there's video of it. They took the video themselves, and there just isn't any of that. Again, I'm not saying that there wasn't. We'll have to see. Perhaps something happened, but there's certainly not evidence of anything. And there's beyond what we know for sure is that it was not systematic or systemic in nature.
And moreover, the truth, if you wanted to make a case for at least, let's say on October 8th, for a disproportionate response, which I am no way advocating, but if you wanted to make the case, I would argue that there is enough that was gruesome and civilian deaths and et cetera that you could emphasize and point to without fabricating lies. And so the question really does come, how likely is it that there is going to be some new evidence of sexual assault that reveals itself when for 8 months there has been such a heavy reliance on such easily disproven lies? I mean, at a certain point, the choice to lie so bald-facedly speaks volumes. And of course, many people watching this are aware that Debbie Wasserman Shultz in the last day or two took to Dana Bash's show to repeat again this fiction that she looked at images that she personally has seen, images that corroborate sexual violence, rape specifically, happening October 7th. And they're able to get away with this because the amazing reporting that has been done by the Electric Intifada and Ali Abu Nitma and the Gray Zone in the Scroll account never crosses over into the mainstream news, and they're able to talk about this with impunity. And I would also like to point out that I can't quite remember if it was this radar or another radar on a similar subject about October 7th rape claims, but I got an incredible amount of pushback about covering this story in particular. And at one point, you have to understand there were a lot of things happening at the same time at the Hill, including staffing issues, where people were being either fired or pushed out because the environment was so toxic, that there were fewer and fewer people that were available to write the blocks for the different segments we were doing every day. Plus, we had this new producer, Joanne, come in. There were technical issues. There was a lot of just things that were making it very difficult to put the show out at the time. So at a certain point, I started saying, I will help by writing some of the scripts for the normal blocks. And I also, frankly, I had an incentive to do so because I could have the Israel stories come out the way I wanted them to, which wasn't really happening due to some of the staffing issues. And also I could, have more of a likelihood that Israel content was going to be covered at all, because there was this push to only do one Israel block a day and to pile everything that was related to Gaza, whether it was a congressional hearing, a censorship issue, a college campus issue, bombs dropped on a refugee camp, protests in Jerusalem, like whatever it was, all those disparate stories to get jammed all into one giant Israel block. So when some of the reporting came, I think when that Sheryl Sandberg story came out, or when one of the big October 7th rape stories came out, I proposed it as a block. And I went ahead and wrote the block to try to be helpful because we had these staffing issues. And when I came into work the next day, Joanne was like, I don't think that we can do this as a block. And basically it's like, you should do this as a radar. And she said that a couple of times, basically forced me to turn what was a straight news story into an editorial story to put distance between the story and the Hill as a news organization, which sometimes, is fine, but at other times puts undue onus on me to seem like I'm doing opinion pieces and that these are subjective arguments that I'm making, and it delegitimizes what were concrete news stories and puts me in the position of feeling like I'm personalizing things. And like now I'm in a debate context with Robbie instead of forcing him to also engage with what were news stories as news stories.
Right. Like it's your feeling that there wasn't evidence, as opposed to here is a reported piece showing that there wasn't evidence of this. We actually have the Debbie Wasserman Shultz major trigger warning because it's a lethal combo of Debbie Wasserman Shultz and Dana Bash. But let's take a look at this clip that you were referring to, Brie.
There was sexual and gender-based violence that occurred on October 7th, that Hamas uses it as a weapon of war, and that any organization, either international or domestic, that denies it is essentially allowing the commission of acts of violence again and again. There can't be an exception for Jewish victims. There can't be an exception for Israelis. The idea that it's Me Too unless you're a Jew is unacceptable. And when you have Republicans in Congress, like we did last week, defund the UN Population Fund, which provides resources all over the world to combat sexual violence against women across the globe, you can see where Republican priorities are compared to President Biden and Vice President Harris, who are using the administration's platform to lead in making sure that these crimes are not only not denied, but that there are consequences for them.
Actually, Brad or Tyler, can one of you find the other clip where she talks about never being able to unsee the images? Sorry, that was the wrong one. Okay, or if anyone has that, well, you can't really put it, you can't put the link in this. We'll cut this out during the edit. But shifting gears, and then we'll return to this because I wanted to show that tweet, but there was another tweet that I want to show, but I also want to bring up an article in the New York Times that really did not get a lot of attention when you compare it to how much attention the Screams Without Words story got. And this is a story. Let me do a screen share. 1 second. Oh, okay. That's, yeah, I wanted to be able to scroll. Can I do that, Brad, or no? Okay. So this is a story. 1 second. Okay. That's weird. I'm having trouble. Hold on. I guess I can't add. That's weird. Brad, can you show that and I'll just read it without showing the actual part I'm reading?
Uh-oh. I think we lost Katie.
Oh no.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
These things
hopefully,
happen.
yeah, these things happen. Anyway, thanks for being on here, Brie.
It is my pleasure. Katie is such a rock, and I really feel like she's my partner on this journey. This now is like it feels like a 2-year saga dealing with this institution. So this is important.
I'm wondering, like, what do you think about your coworkers remaining there? Like, do you think that that's the right thing for them to do, to continue doing what they're doing, etc.? Or would there be a point where they'd be like, no, I'm out of here? You know what I mean?
Well, look, I think that I'm glad, because I think Jessica is the co-host with whom I have the most politically in common. I think she's really wonderful. And I think for the same reason that I thought it was important to be at an outlet, like a corporate news outlet, advancing leftist politics, I think it's important for her to be there. So I would hate for her to leave and them to replace her with some of the other left chairs we've had. I won't name names, who, I don't see how that benefits anybody. What Robbie does is that, from politically, is less material to me, because obviously it's no secret that I don't share his politics. But I do wonder, just from a professional perspective, I mean, Robbie has been the longest standing host since Crystal and Sagar. And so he's been present through the firing of Kim Iverson for ideological reasons, different ones, but ideological reasons. The firing of Katie, and now the firing of me. And so I think there is some question about whether or not his reaction to each of those basically enables them to continue to do this. Like, if they know that he's always going to be there and that there aren't going to be any consequences, and at some point, is he going to kick and scream a little bit more, because he's the one that has to try to pull the show back out of the dregs and rehabilitate it after each of these instances where there's, significant fall off in viewership, and everyone has to just fight like mad to get the train back on the tracks.
Well, Katie, are you good?
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
All right.
And,
thanks.
Okay. And Brad, I sent you that the correct file. But I just want to contrast all the discussion of alleged systemic rape that we saw on October 7th with a story that we saw in the New York Times inside the base where Israel has detained thousands of Gazans. And I'm going to read a part of that article. It says, Mr. Al-Hamlawi, the senior nurse, said a female officer had ordered 2 soldiers to lift him up and press his, and I always say this ironically, but this really is a trigger warning. There's sexual violence description. Mr. Al-Hamlawi, the senior nurse, said a female officer had ordered 2 soldiers to lift him up and press his rectum against a metal stick that was fixed to the ground. Mr. Al-Hamlawi said the stick penetrated his rectum for roughly 5 seconds, causing it to bleed and leaving him with, quote, unbearable pain, unquote. A leaked draft of the UNRWA report detailed an interview that gave a similar account. It cited a 41-year-old detainee who said that interrogators, quote, made me sit on something like a hot metal stick and it felt like fire, end quote. And also said that another detainee, quote, died after they put the electric stick up, end quote, his anus. And those are just the examples of sexual violence in that article. And the article talks about physical torture. And, you know, we did not see kind of CNN host after CNN host talking about Israel's systemic violence and torture and sexual violence against Palestinians, interestingly enough.
Yeah, the irony of having someone sort of holler "believe women" at you in the wake of those reports, because those were out at the time, you know, reports of sexual violence, particularly that targeted Palestinian men, but also gender-based violence, ripping people's head coverings off and the like, have been coming out for the whole duration. I mean, prior to October 7th, obviously, it was a known that there was systemic sexual abuse of Palestinian prisoners in Israel, including Palestinian children. So, I mean, again, like, it's interesting because all of that was running through my mind during the interview as well. You know, the extent to which, you know, okay, I'm going to pick my battles. I'm not going to confront this woman, you know, who's not a politician and is going through something very personal. But certainly the irony of someone citing fake debunked rape claims when there are all of these very real, very brutal sexual assault to the point of death. Katie, what you just described was a man being anally raped to death. And your average American has no idea that that happened because the only place we're allowed to talk about it is on Twitter or YouTube. And maybe not, I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't have said those words because of monetization and the way that this app acts about app acts about the R word. But I mean, it's frankly, it's overwhelming. I'm furious, but then I go through these periods of like my adrenal glands can't take being in a constant state of rage. It's dispiriting. And every day on the Hill, it was like a battle to, like, it almost felt like from the production perspective, I almost understand them wanting to put a cap on stories that make Israel look bad, because there were so many stories that would come out on a daily basis that make Israel look like a craven, despicable, unsupportable nation. Right. That like I felt like I had to pull punches sometimes because I'm like, wow, this feels like I'm beating up on Israel by just reporting the news as it's coming down the transom. And then there's this effort to sort of other sides, like both sides it. But the reality of the situation is that there have been no more, you know, there's soldiers that are killed in the conflict, you know, fighting in Gaza, but there's no more civilian Israeli deaths. That all stopped after October 7th. And every single day we get news report after news report about a new bomb that's been dropped on somebody's new refugee camp, or some person in a fishing boat that's been hit with sniper fire, or a man selling at a vendor on the side of the road who was shot by a drone yesterday. And it's like, I guess we're not going to report that because what? The one horror story bleeds into the next and there doesn't seem to be any end to it. I don't know. Right. It was a very, very, very toxic situation for a very long time. And every single time you might say like, oh, well, you did cover multiple Israel stories a day. Yeah. One, because it was a fight, and two, because we would be in the middle of a filming day and like stuff would be breaking. And there was more leeway around, there was an understanding that if you caught a breaking story, it would basically be good for the algorithm. Like you could get more clicks off of it. So, you know, we would often add stuff in the middle of the day that would end up like broadening out the coverage a little bit. You know, there'd be a press conference that we could cover, you know, something like that. But I need people to understand that when I say this happened, I believe this happened because of my coverage of Israel. It's because every day for months, it's been a knockdown, drag out fight. Ever since the old producer, who was lovely, left, it's been a knockdown, drag out fight over editorial control with Joanne, including to the extent to which, to the point where she started trying to exert increasing editorial control over radars, which were supposed to be sacrosanct.
And something else that's interesting is that I've heard you talk about this. Israel clips did well in terms of numbers and, ratings. So that's more evidence, given that, like every corporation, the Hill cares about its bottom line. The fact that they weren't encouraging of that content really suggests that there was a censorship issue.
Absolutely. I mean, there would be days where, I'd say, look, you think we're covering Israel too much, but the audience loves it. The biggest performing videos are about Israel Gaza. I would go over to Breaking Point and say, look, they did 8 segments today. 5 or 6 of their segments were Israel related. And again, this is a broad range of topics that can be considered Israel related. There's a protest at UCLA that's Israel related. They censure Rashida Tlaib, that's Israel related. They bomb Rafah, that's Israel related. The bridge, the $300 million pier floats off into the ocean. That's Israel. I mean, like, the whole world is talking about this, right? So there's a million domestic and international stories that are related to it. Seinfeld, exactly. A celebrity says something. Jamal Bowen has an APAC challenge. I mean, all of these things are happening concurrently, right? But I would go over and say, look, not only have they done, frankly, more than half of their blocks about Israel, their numbers are fantastic. What about that? It didn't matter. And it was particularly frustrating for me because there have been times, obviously, like, Robbie and I have different politics. The show covers a lot of different, appeals to a broad range of kind of political independence. So a lot of stuff that I will be honest about the fact that I obviously would prefer not to cover. They're not my issues, whether it's some, trans panic issue or, libs at TikTok, whatever kind of silly culture war stuff that I think is a distraction from the material politics that should be uniting us. It's not my favorite, but I have to acknowledge that if we cover something about what Joe Rogan said or Bill Maher said or whatever, that the audience wants that. And there's a certain amount of business decision that's being made. And so I'm not going to fight it. But after years, what I felt was like being a team player. Like, I would propose stories in the Slack all the time that I knew were germane to Robbie's interest, even if I didn't particularly want to talk about it. Like, oh, here's a new, COVID related story. Here's a new hearing that happened. Here's a clip that I think you're going to want to respond to, because I understand the balance of the show, right? But finally, when it came down to one of my interest areas actually being aligned with the audience that was more right-leaning, and them having excitement about it and them really driving the numbers up on it, suddenly all the arguments that had been made to me about why we needed to cover what Joe Rogan said on the podcast yesterday went out the window. All of the practical arguments went out the window, even to the extent to which I would say, oh, look, Norm Finkelstein went on this show or that show, and immediately 350,000 views. Like, this is a no-brainer. No, we can't have Norm Finkelstein on the show because he is a, quote, Holocaust denier, was what I was told.
So can you tell us about that? Because I heard that. So this, of course, as people know, you've had him on. I've had him on. He's a prolific scholar of Palestine and Israel, and the son of 2 Holocaust survivors. And every other member of his family on his mother's side and his father's side were wiped out, perished in the Holocaust. And the reason you were not allowed to bring him on was because he's allegedly a Holocaust denier?
That I was told that there was a specific, I don't want to get his name wrong. I was told which Hill employee said this and put the kibosh on him. I just have to remember his last name. But yes, I was told that this specific individual put a moratorium on having Norm on, and that was a hard line.
Because he's a Holocaust denier.
Because he's a Holocaust denier.
Wow.
That's
well,
correct.
He's going to have to update his book, The Holocaust Industry, to include that that anecdote in it. And I just wanted to say, related to that article that I showed about the sexual abuse of Palestinian detainees, prisoners, innocent people who were rounded up. We also know, of course, that Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur on the Palestinian occupied territories, has talked about how there are so many reports on sexual violence, and she's talked to many journalists, and then they, for some reason, never run the interview. And we also know that Josh Paul, who was at the State Department, who resigned from the State Department, told Christiane Amanpour. So this was not on some, lefty YouTube show. This was on CNN, on Christiane Amanpour, told Christiane Amanpour that there was a case where a an NGO, a Palestinian NGO, said that a boy had been sexually abused in custody. The State Department believed it was credible, brought it to the Israeli government, and their response was to criminalize and shut down that charity. So again, this is something that the media could be talking about, but is choosing not to. Really quickly, I just want to show, before we bring on our next guest, who I'm so excited to bring on, I just want to show, this is what Debbie Wasserman Shultz had to say about sexual violence on October 7th. I'll carry images of sexual violence from 10/7 with me for the rest of my life. So that suggests that she saw those images, although, as we know, much like Joe Biden claimed to see images of atrocity, he did not. He lied about that 3 times. So to be fair to Debbie Wasserman Shultz, I guess she's more honest. She's going to have to lie 2 more times before she beats Joe Biden's record of dishonesty. And then let's see what Dana Bash said about it. So Dana Bash says, Debbie Wasserman Shultz joined me to shine a bright light on the sexual violence Hamas uses as a weapon of war, detailed in Sheryl Sandberg's documentary. And Debbie Wasserman Shultz says denialism of that violence is outrageous, and we have to make sure that we knock it down. Now, this is not the first time that Dana Bash has lied about the sexual violence weaponized on October 7th. Let's take a look. This is from December. This is Dana Bash with Premila Jayapal.
I remember that.
15,000 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli airstrikes, 3/4 of whom are women and children.
And it's horrible, but you don't see Israeli soldiers raping.
Well, Dana, I
Palestinian
think
women.
we're not.
That is such a perfect example of how this is used, right? It is used to justify what Israel is doing because there's a qualitative difference between the Palestinians,
That's right,
Hamas, and the Israelis, who just don't do that. They just don't do that kind of
That's
violence.
right. But also Israelis are fully doing that.
Right.
They're fully raping Palestinian prisoners.
Right.
So
yeah, but Dana Bash
I
doesn't
mean,
think
that's what I mean.
possible.
Like, I know this is maybe like a pedantic point. Like, maybe it's just so obvious, but I ever since I did that dissident dialogues debate back in like at the beginning of last month, whenever it was, it has been so crystal clear to me that the foundation of everything that Israel is doing, it's propped up entirely on a racist perception of who Palestinians are. Like, It is unsustainable. All of this would sound crazy if you replaced any other like white race,
like
white Christian
Danes.
like group of people, like Danes. Yes, just slot that in when they say Palestinians, and you will immediately hear how absurd and nonsensical the arguments that are being made are. And at that point, Premila Jayapal, who I have a lot of issues with, was rightly pointing to how cataclysmic 15,000 deaths were.
Right.
15,000. We've been stuck at 35,000 for like 3 months now because Israel has killed every person with the expertise and institutional ability to keep track of the dead. Hospital administrators, doctors, humanitarian aid workers. And so we're stuck at 35,000 because Israel has killed the people who do the counting. And we're still not able to convince our elected leadership to change course, even as I'm sure you covered this elsewhere, Katie, even as today we all watched Benjamin Netanyahu give but was basically a middle finger to Joe Biden saying, we're not going to stop. This isn't our peace deal and we're not going to stop.
Right. Well, I'm so excited to be bringing on another guest to join us. This is the first time he's been on the show, so really excited. I've been wanting this to happen for a really long time. Marc Lamont is a cultural anthropologist, critical policy scholar, and presidential professor at the CUNY Graduate Center. He's the author of several books, including Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, and he's a host at BET News, Al Jazeera Upfront, and his own YouTube show, Night School. So welcome, Marc.
Hey, good to see everybody. This is
You
the
too.
unemployment line. I love it.
Yeah, the unemployment line. Yeah. So Marc,
that'll be our new podcast. We'll call it the unemployment line.
Yeah. And Brie and I can have a special segment called Over the Hill or something.
Ooh,
yeah.
that's good.
Yeah.
Well, Marc can be in on that too, because his last name is Hill.
how
Oh
that
yes,
works.
you're right. I was thinking about the hill connection when I was typing this up in YouTube, and I was like, "Fired by the hill, Marc Lamont Hill." You're right, over the hill. There we have it. We have it. This is destined.
Great
It's
minds.
destined. It's verschert, right? You probably know that language more than I do, Marc, but we'll get into that in a second. So Marc, you were fired in 2018 from CNN. So
Yeah.
you walked so I could run, so Brie could sprint. But
Yes.
we're going to actually play a clip of you, and this is what you said that got you fired. Anything you want to say about this? I know this was at the UN. Before we play a little bit of it.
Yeah. This was the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, and I was asked to be a speaker representing civil society. It was the spot reserved for a non-Palestinian to talk about what's going on.
Great. So let's take a look.
The Universal Declaration for Human Rights says that all people are, quote, born free and equal in dignity and rights. The Israeli nation state continues to restrict freedom and undermine equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, as well as those in the West Bank and Gaza. At the current moment, there are more than 60 Israeli laws that deny Palestinians access to full citizenship rights, simply because they're not Jewish. From housing to education to family reunification, it is clear that any freedoms naturally endowed to all human beings are actively being stripped away from Palestinians through Israeli statecraft. To not just offer solidarity in words, but to commit to political action, grassroots action, local action, and international action that will give us what justice requires. And that is a free Palestine from the river to the sea.
So those were very powerful words. Tell us what happened, how you found out that you were going to be no longer working with CNN.
Yeah, it was such a weird 24 hours. I had led a delegation to Palestine, and I had been there. I'd been there the entire maybe 2 weeks. And I left. In fact, I'd left Khan al-Ahmar, which is a village that was being at the time destroyed to make room for Israeli settlements. And I flew back to make this UN speech. And I don't write speeches ever. I do them off the top of my head, not off the top of my head, but I don't write them. I do things in my brain. And I said, you know what, this is a really high stakes speech, and I don't want to cause any controversy, so I'm going to write this one. And on the plane ride back, I actually wrote this speech out, and I thought it was solid. Up until maybe the last 2 or 3 minutes, I ran out of time as I'm rushing to get from the airport to Brooklyn to change to get to the thing. And I give this speech, and I don't think anything of it. I sort of freestyled the last few minutes, but I thought I was on solid ground. I didn't say anything crazy. I got an ovation inside of the UN. I thought it went really well. They came up to me afterwards. Someone came up to me and said, hey, Egypt is a little upset because I had said something about Rafah and what was going on at the border, and they didn't want to be implicated. They were just frustrated. I was like, if Egypt is mad at my critique, and certainly Israel will be mad, I'm probably not doing it's probably not the worst outcome, right? It means I'm honest, because there's enough critique to go in a lot of places. Not even critique, but critique. So anyway, I leave there that day thinking it's a good job. I noticed on Twitter there was a handle UN Watch. I noticed a bunch of the extremist Zionist accounts were starting to tweet at me and tell me that I had said something awful and done something awful, but they hadn't honed in on any particular thing yet. It felt like they were just spitballing at this point. Everything was anti-Semitic, everything was evil, everything was wrong with the speech. But then I noticed it started to ratchet up by the end of the day. I was a little anxious about it, but not particularly anxious, because it's always happens. I'm on the train back to Philadelphia the next morning, and I get a call from Rebecca Cutler over at CNN, and she's the person who manages the talent. Very nice woman. We've always had good interactions. And she said, "Hey, we need to talk." And I said, "Is this about the UN speech?" She said, "Yeah." She said, "I said, well, I was starting to explain whatever, because I'm assuming they're just responding to the kind of Zionist pressure that you get on Twitter, because they will write letters, they will do all kinds of things." And she said, "Yeah." She said, "Unfortunately, the speech wasn't in line with our values, and therefore, you can no longer appear on air as a CNN contributor." And I said, "Well, did you hear the speech? Did you read the speech?" She said, "Yeah, I don't have a verbatim of the whole speech, but I got the important parts." I said, "Well, what part of that did you find problematic? And she said, it's not in line with our values. And I asked her like 2 more questions, and the answer just kept being, it's not in line with our values, which in retrospect is probably true.
Right.
But it was very clear that, from what I gathered, that she was carrying out something, that it wasn't her decision. And I didn't have a sense of whether she agreed or disagreed, but it was very clear that it wasn't coming from her. And so she was told to say X very carefully, and then you move on. And that was the last I heard of CNN. I had another maybe year and a half on my contract, which they paid me for.
That's nice.
And I never appeared again. And the other piece of it, though, just which I think is important, is that Temple University, where I was a professor, also was outraged. And the head of the board of trustees said that I had blackened the name of Temple University, and that I can't make this stuff up, and that I went on an anti-Semitic rant, and that he had never seen anything so morally objectionable before. That would be absurd on its face, but it only became more absurd when you find out that this person, who said that I was the most morally objectionable person he'd ever encountered, and who advocated for me to be fired from Temple, is Bill Cosby's personal attorney.
Stop.
You cannot make this up.
You can't make it up.
Oh my God.
And to my knowledge, and Temple then went through a process of trying to fire me. Now, I'm a tenured full professor at the time, but that didn't stop them from trying. And I remember getting a call from the dean at Temple, and wonderful guy, that my dean was a wonderful guy. And he said, look, I'm getting a call from upstairs, and basically the board is meeting about you today, and they're deciding what to do with your job. And but I'm tenured. What do you mean? What are you going to do with my job? And they said, well, he said, from what I hear, they're going to fire you, or take your chair, or write a letter of rebuke, or do nothing, or suspend you, or do nothing. He said, and they're probably not going to fire you, but they're definitely not going to do nothing. And you'll find out at the end of the day. And so for the next 8 hours, I'm just hoping to find out something about whether I'm getting fired or not. And at the end of the day, they decided to not fire me, but write a letter of reprimand and rebuke and all this other stuff. I think I may be the first person in Temple history to get this. Not Bill Cosby. I want to point that out again. He's an alum and and on the board of trustees. And from that point forward, I was the Temple thing was resolved. I didn't get fired. The CNN thing was resolved. I did get fired. But there's one more tiny thing that I thought was really interesting, is that the provost's office and the president's office at Temple kept getting letters, and the dean's office kept getting letters about me. I mean, stacks, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters about me. There were postcards. They were all saying the same thing. They were clearly mass produced, but they were all from alum and donors of Temple saying they will not give another $1 and they will never support the university until I'm gone. My dean, being an investigative journalist himself, he's a former editor at the whatever the Seattle thing is, their big newspaper there.
Times?
Yeah, I think it's Sun-Times, maybe Seattle Sun-Times. Maybe.
Yeah.
He starts calling some of the people back to find out, like, well, I want to explain to you what happened. I want to hear your side of what you found so objectionable about what Marc said. And to a person, none of the names on that card were members of Temple University's alumni family, and most had not heard of me. So that's just something to think about as we think about sort of how organized the outrage and manufactured the outrage is about some of this stuff. I just want to lay that kind of context.
Yeah. And just this week, Roz Siegel, the Israeli-American Jewish genocide studies professor, had his position at University of Minnesota rescinded because he was one of the early people who talked about, who called it genocide. He wrote a textbook case for genocide. He published that in Jewish Currents.
Yes, I remember the piece. Yeah.
So why is this? This is a huge question. Oh, sorry, Briahna, go. You want to say something?
No, my all-time favorite law professor is also the subject of a lawsuit right now with some Jewish students at HLS accusing him of course, they frame it as Jewish students. There are a million Jewish students who love him and have voted for him for every year for like the duration of his teaching there. He wins like Professor of the Year award. But a bunch of Zionist students who are accusing him of kind of a hostile classroom environment because he talked about Gaza.
Wow. Just talking about it.
Yeah. I mean, and having an opinion on it, that's not flattering to Israel. But, the reason he's such a beloved professor is that because he has he's like a down low Marxist economist, but like he approaches the classroom so like subtly and compassionately. He really does kind of slow roll you over the course of the semester into looking at the law very differently than the right-wing way it's usually taught in law schools. And people love him. He's beloved. And one of the most compassionate men I've ever met in my life. And sensitive and very gentle, and they're trying to get him fired as well. So it's everywhere. And I just also wanted to respond, Marc, to the kind of coordinated feel of it. I mean, my mom has been asking me, do I feel overwhelmed or whatever? I mean, yes and no, because it's so obvious when you've been the victim, when you've been the target of these kinds of attacks. And even outside of the context of Israel-Palestine, this is not the first time I've experienced a kind of targeted internet campaign. When it feels fake. And right. I similarly got like hundreds of emails to the bad faith email account directed to, addressed to Patreon, telling Patreon to end its relationship with me. And a week or so before I was ultimately fired, there was another pile-on where they took a clip from the dissident dialogues debate that had happened like a month beforehand and tried to manufacture that into an excuse to fire me. So part of me is even frustrated about having to kind of nitpick about the eye roll and is it an eye roll and is it too much of an eye roll? And because it wasn't about that. Like they were going to keep manufacturing crises every week until they got one that provided enough cover for the Hill to do what it's been wanting to do for a long time, which is fire me.
Yeah. Yes. And that was a setup. I mean, as you alluded to at the beginning, this was someone handpicking you to like requesting to be on the show, which you agreed to do graciously. It was obviously a setup. And then, but if they had wanted to prevent, what they could have done, I'm not saying they should have, but they could have easily just done one shot of the guest. If you had done was so objectionable.
Right. But nobody cared until it was manufactured. I mean, I saw a lot of comments along the lines of, I watched that interview and don't remember anything wrong and had to go back and figure out why it was that suddenly everybody was talking about it. Because it was a 20-minute interview where, the guest, as she should have been, was given a lot of latitude to say a lot of things that I found, frankly, Islamophobic and objectionable, but which were a part of her, story and her journey, and that's fine. But the core issue is that the same bad actors, and again, I don't want to say this person's name because I did so in another interview about the subject, and he clipped that and sent a bunch of people after me on social media because of that. So I'm not going to give this person any more attention, but it's the same person who had been on the show before and started a targeted campaign on the basis of our interview together is the person that was behind both the dissident dialogues pile-on and this most recent pile-on that got me fired. And to not be able to see that this is a systematic campaign, and as a producer to feed into it instead of having the instinct to protect, the talent on the show, I think spoke volumes about the environment that I've been in for a very, very long time at the Hill.
Right. And I want to ask you both, what does this tell us? I mean, we all know we've experienced it firsthand, but we've also witnessed it happening to others. Norman Finkelstein, Juan Cole, Nathan Robinson, Stephen Salaita. What does this tell us, though, about Zionism?
That's an interesting question.
No, it's a huge one, too.
I think one of the things that I found interesting about Finkelstein and Salaita, I'll speak just from the academic perspective, and this was the case with me as well at Temple. It didn't play out the way they wanted it to, but people were very much willing to call for my firing despite me having tenure. There's a kind of politics of terror attached to the strategies that they deploy, meaning they know that if they don't hire Salaita, or if they fire Salaita from Urbana, University of Illinois Urbana, they're going to have to pay him. Just like they knew if they fired me as a tenured professor that they were going to have to do that. I was almost not hired at the City University of New York, despite being the most qualified person for the job and being voted unanimously by the faculty. And the reason was they would rather have a lawsuit and pay the lawsuit, but communicate to the public and to other faculty members that these are the stakes attached to taking this position. And so they would have gladly paid me millions of dollars or whatever it would have been, who knows, to fire me from Temple just so that they could say that they got rid of me. And Temple, as they told me when Temple called me into the office and said, or into the president's office at the time, Dick Englert, he said, "Look, you're going to have to think about how to reimburse the university for all the money we've lost, or all the potential money we will lose from donors and people who will write us out of their will." So for him, it's also a business calculation, right? That we'll fire you and pay a lawsuit to keep our donor base happy. And this isn't about like Jewish people, right? Because a lot of these donors are right-wing evangelicals. There are all kinds of people who aren't even Jewish. This isn't about Jewish people doing this. This is about people who are supportive of the Israel lobby, and they're willing to take this position even at a high cost to send the message that anyone who takes a sufficiently critical position against the state of Israel is disposable and cannot function within this space. And so that's the thing that I keep watching. I'm watching people get fired from media jobs. I'm watching people get fired from academic jobs. And the university knows they're in the wrong, and they're even willing to pay the price because they can then say, "Hey, but we did it." And it didn't create, again, a politics of fear, or a sentiment of fear, not even a politics, an actual sentiment of fear among other academics who will whisper to me. I mean, I can't tell you how many people at CNN were texting me like, "You're right. Oh my God, you're so right. I can't believe they did this to you." And I'm like, "Hey, why don't we all organize? And then they won't do this to us. They can't fire all of us." And they're like, "Yeah, no, we're not going to do that, but we really support you." Same thing with academics, even tenured academics. And so it's working. The strategy of creating fear is very effective.
Yeah, Don Lemon, I did an interview with him last week, and he basically said as much. It was interesting talking to him because there were moments where he was making what I felt were sort of admissions that he didn't seem to think of as kind of big disclosures. And one of them was that he noted that many of his former colleagues from CNN had been texting him about how afraid they've been to comment on the genocide in Gaza after October 7th. And I was kind of like, well, what do you think about that? I mean, does that give you pause as you start your independent media career? I mean, tell me more about that conversation. But it's interesting to me how everyone seems to be willing to acknowledge that the real kind of cancel culture and silencing that's going on, or at least the most acute context in which that is happening, is quite obviously around Israel-Palestine, but that has been largely absent from the discourse around censorship, including from many of the people who've spent the last 5 years or so making their entire careers about censorship and cancel culture. And I applaud people like Glenn Greenwald, who are so incredibly consistent about this. But unfortunately, a lot of people have gotten exposed as frauds because they don't give a damn about Palestine.
Right.
Yeah. I'm curious, want to hear from both of you. How did this become an important issue to you?
For me, it started, I've always been interested in the Middle East. I'm an anthropologist who thinks about questions around race and citizenship and identity and such in the United States for sure, but also in the Middle East, and particularly in Africa. I mean, particularly in Palestine. And I also think a lot about sort of the Black Muslim diaspora. So there are all these things that brought me into the region. But I became increasingly interested after I worked at CNN. I started to engage. They would bring me on to debate Dershowitz, just as I'm just the generic Democratic strategist, although I've never been a Democrat in my life.
Right.
I was just Black, right? So, and they brought me there. It's like on the old growing up, like the old WWF matches where like whoever the star is, you'd come out and he'd wrestle some tomato can you never heard of before, and the match would go 2 minutes and the fans would cheer. The idea was they brought me on because they thought I didn't know anything about it, and that Alan Dershowitz would just mop the floor with me and keep going, or that I would agree with him, and we wouldn't have a real conversation. I have a graduate degree in Middle Eastern studies. So it didn't go the way they wanted it to, but then that got me more engaged in the topic. And then Ferguson Summer happened, and Mike Brown was killed on August 9th of 2014. And I was in Ferguson covering it, and I was on the ground. And at the same time, of course, Operation Protective Edge was happening in Gaza for 51 days. And so there was a lot of solidarity. There was a lot of conversation. There was a lot of overlap. There's all this cool stuff happening. And I ended up going on a delegation to Palestine with the Dream Defenders that January of 2015. And while I was on the ground there, you know, it's hard to see that and look away, you know. I already had an intellectual understanding. I'd already been studying and reading about the issue for a long time. But being on the ground in East Jerusalem, where I've spent the last decade, almost 9 years doing anthropological research. But being on the ground in East Jerusalem, being on the ground in the West Bank, being on the ground in Hebron in particular, being even inside the state of Israel, and seeing these things on the ground, it just dramatically changed how I thought about it and what I thought my role as an American was, and what solidarity looked like to me. And so I became more engaged with it, and the more engaged I got, the more resistance I experienced. The more resistance I experienced, the more I was like, "Oh shit, I must be on to something here," and I just kept drilling down.
Yeah,
and so that became the thing.
Marc, I'm curious. I mean, that point about the resistance really resonates with me, because I remember, Marc, I had you on Bad Faith like years ago to talk about Progressive Except for Palestine, and I remember feeling very nervous about that conversation. And I remember asking you about the UN speech and like, well, what was it, you know, coming from a fairly naive place, like what was it that was supposed to be so controversial? And remember us kind of having a back and forth, I think, with the co-writer of your book about, you know, river to the sea, and there's this interpretation and that interpretation. And it feels like another planet now that we've kind of blasted through that discourse. People, you know, the irony is that the Overton window seems to have shifted dramatically in favor of being able to say, I mean, like, there were people, even Norm, God bless him, I love him, but even Norm was kind of doing a little bit of the tone policing of the sloganing, especially earlier on, closer to October 7th. But like, I think it's been kind of demonstrated that you kind of come off as a weepy scold, not Norm, but like the Zionist, you know, angry people, like a weepy scold when you're the one that's focusing on a slogan, and the sloganeers are focusing on tens of thousands of people who have been brutally killed, and another almost 100,000 people who have been injured, in an entire population of millions that are starving to death, right? So there is something optimistic about that, but it is interesting to reflect back on the timidity that I brought to the conversation, and the fear that I had even trying to engage with it as a podcaster who wanted to know more from an expert like yourself in a safe space of my own podcast, because it had been telegraphed so loudly that this was a hot button issue. I didn't even have like a real job, I think, at the time. I think I was only just still podcasting. And I still felt like I might lose something, even if it was only reputational harm. And I wonder, I mean, how are you thinking about that now? Like, when you listen back to your speech, like the way we just did, do you think it was the river to the sea part? And how are you feeling about that slogan now? Like,
I think river to the sea was my, I think river to the sea was my eye roll, you know?
Yeah.
Had I not said it, they would have found something. And very similarly, most of the people who were outraged at it, you know, I had never heard it before. They were walking. If you had asked them 5 minutes before the newspaper headlines came out, you know, what do you think when you think river to the sea? They would have said nothing, right? So it was a manufactured outrage. It wasn't written into my speech.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I don't know if I would have written it. I probably would not have, just because it's, you know, but I was, you know, I was feeling it, you know, in the moment. And again, I hadn't finished the speech, and that was the last couple of minutes, and that's where the freestyle came in. So I don't know, you know, sort of where my brain would have gone. But after I said it, I didn't feel like I had crossed some crazy line, because I knew enough about river to the sea to understand just how widely that phrase is used, and how differently it's used in different political spaces, from Likud to mainstream liberal Zionists to PFLP to PLO to Hamas, and etc. So I understood as it's almost like a floating signifier. It means lots of different things to lots of different people. But it was something easy to seize upon. But it's important to understand that that wasn't the first thing they seized upon. There had been leaks in the Daily, other newspapers that had said that, you know, there are concerns about Marc Lamont Hill at CNN, right? And there were like 2 or 3 other mini controversies that I was able to put out, like fires I was able to put out, where I was accused of doing something that I didn't do when I was a kid, but then by the time the fourth thing comes, or the third thing comes, it's like, okay, well, he has a reputation for doing this kind of thing. Similarly,
this isn't the first time.
Right, this isn't the first time. Just like they could say, Briahna Joy Gray called for the demographic destruction of Israel, or she called for the end to the Jewish state. And it's like, yeah, she didn't call for the end of Jewish people. She called for a secular democratic state to be created. And that's okay, even if you disagree with it. But because that became the discourse, and then it shifts to this, it's like, so in the back of people's minds, like, there's always a thing with her. If there's always a thing with her about the Jews, then she must be anti-Semitic, right? If Marc is always being misunderstood, then maybe it's him, right? And so that it becomes harder. So they manufacture the outrage in a steady campaign, right? And so I don't know if it would have mattered. I just don't think it would have. If I had not said River to the Sea, it would have been something else.
Yeah.
I think you're right. There were a series of Daily Beast hit pieces on me as well. I just Googled it to remind myself. The first one was on October 16th, so they didn't really waste any time. But what I remember about that one was that it was like they're shouting at the Hill and some people are concerned. And then they framed it as though they cited a specific instance, framed it as though I was the one shouting, but I think that's the one where Robbie screamed the F word at me. And that is a part of why the eye roll stuff is so eye rollable. Because I mean, if the decorum arguments are undermined by the lack of decorum.
He threw a pen. He threw a pen at you too.
He threw a pen. He called me a simpleton. He shouted the F word on air, like over and over and over. And I'm not saying that I didn't give back at the same time, but I certainly never shouted duck in the middle of a segment and like threatened to walk off and throw my pen and all of that sort of a thing. And there's a layer of like racial and gender coding to all of this. There's a lot going on, but it felt very clear that the Hill was willing to, and people at the Hill leaked to that for that story and other stories, were willing to kind of see the ground and see, like, to your point, Marc, to set kind of expectations that Briahna is this like loud, angry Black woman who can't control herself, particularly when it comes to Israel, and that therefore someone will buy a decorum argument. Like they basically set the stage for what the kind of internet troll, the Zionist troll who manufactured many of these crises, eventually capitalized on, which was this perception that a flicker of an eye at the end of a segment, at least when attached to a person who looks like me, is a fireable offense. But Robbie, and I'm not trying to make this about Robbie, but Robbie literally screaming F at me on air isn't.
It's wild.
Yeah. The double standards are pretty glaring. Yeah.
Oh, and not even to mention the kind of like factual issues where, I mean, there was a clip going around last week where we were debating the question of whether or not the 40 beheaded baby story hoax was real months after the Biden campaign had already been forced to retract Joe Biden, saying that he had seen images with his own eyes. And so this is why it was getting heated, right? Because I'm in a situation where, because we don't do reporting on these things, everything just has to come off as an editorial, like my radar and my opinion, even when it's very difficult to establish a factual record, and then it becomes a subject of debate. Did Biden actually retract the 40 beheaded baby story? Well, Briahna says she did. Well, no, if we had just done a segment on it, then it wouldn't be as contentious, but they refused to do many of these things outside of the context of me doing an opinion-based radar.
And that, I think, speaks to why, because they wanted to be able to relegate it to feelings and opinions as opposed to facts.
Right.
Even though
there were no consequences for other people getting facts so dramatically wrong, so loudly, and with such, frankly, dismissive disdain for their coworker while they were making wrong arguments.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, one of the things that I find so almost revealing and helpful in the attacks on you, Brie, and it kind of reminds me, Marc, of what you said about how they thought that you wouldn't be able to defend yourself against Dershowitz. But anyone who kind of like doubts either of your intellectual abilities is just so either dishonest or actually stupid. And to see the attacks on you recently, Brie, as you just don't know what you're talking about. I mean, the
DEI Barbie, babe.
All right, good. Okay,
I gotta make some t-shirts and monetize it at this point.
Yeah, you should make a doll. It should be a Brie doll too. And you can have a DEI t-shirt on or something. But, you know, the nerve of people to not know their own limitations, like the gall to hear them talk about you, Brie, and the same would be said of you, Marc, although it hasn't happened recently, but to hear people try to talk about you as stupid, some kind
it
of
happens every day. I started doing a thing, and I've stopped doing it because I didn't want it to become just an ego exercise. But like, do you know Brian Scalabrine? Brian Scalabrine is this NBA player, former NBA player. He's like, you know, he's well known in the Boston Celtics. Yuck. And he was like maybe like the 10th or 11th, right? He was like the 10th or 11th best guy on the team. And people would always boo. He's a tall, red-haired white guy, right? So he's an easy guy to pick on in the NBA because he looks like he doesn't belong, except, you know, he's like 7 feet tall and like a freakishly good athlete compared to the rest of the world, just not compared to the rest of the NBA. So after he retired, he started playing guys one-on-one. He would like play the guy who played Division II basketball. He'd play the guy who, you know, who would scream, "You're a bum" from the cheap seats, and he would just beat the shit out of them for like 11-0, 7-0. You know, they wouldn't even score. And he would say to them, "You think this is harder than it looks." And he would say, "I'm closer to LeBron James than you are to me," right? And there was this way that from the outside, you could scream from the cheap seats and make assumptions about him without really understanding all the layers, all the knowledge, all the study, all the work that goes into even getting into this, to being part of this conversation, even if one were to believe that I were on the wrong side of the issue. And so what I found was when I first got into the issue, the Zionist activists who were reactionary, who weren't scholars themselves, who weren't well read themselves, would assume that that in general pro-Palestinian people just don't know anything, right? But particularly people of color. The assumption is, right, that we are the Brian Scalabrinis of international politics, right? That we're there, but we don't belong, that we don't know enough, that we're not smart enough, and that the only thing we should be talking about is race and racism in America. And anything outside of that, and maybe, you know, be surrogates for the Democratic Party, but still only to the extent that we're talking about, you know, nothing fancy like the economy, just like
the black
DEI-ish. Yeah, right, exactly. And so what happens is, so there's multiple things happening, right? One is just the assumption we don't know foreign policy. Then the assumption is, if we're involved in this conversation, our motivations must be different than we're suggesting they are, i.e. we are probably anti-Semites who are using this as a shield, right? Or as a cover to smuggle in this anti-Semitic discourse, that we just hate the Jews and Israel, and we don't have an issue with Israel, we have an issue with the Jews, right? And this becomes the argument. And which goes into a deeper argument about Black people, brown people, Muslims being anti-Semitic until proven otherwise. And so the idea that, and then of course, it's just the idea that Black people aren't smart, right? So calling, I mean, I watched one guy say all Briahna talks about is race. I wish DEI Barbie would shut up, you know, or something like that. And it's like, you're invoking race. No one talked about race until you called her DEI Barbie, but they don't hear themselves, right? They literally don't hear themselves. And because it's an ideology so steeped in white supremacy and racism and all these other things, they are actually sort of shaping and coloring the discourse with that stuff and not even realizing it. And so I don't get it the way I used to, because I've done enough. I've debated enough people on this that, you know, it's not an easy fight for them. But deep down, a lot of people still operate from the assumption that I don't know what I'm talking about, or that I'm being manipulated and used by Palestinians or by JVP or by some other organization. That I'm basically a useful idiot for forces beyond my control.
Yeah, it was. I mean, and I don't know how you keep getting people on your show, by the way. It's amazing watching like Israeli spokesperson after Israeli spokesperson come on your show, Marc. Do they also underestimate you, or do they just want
every time
exposure?
It's I would say, so there's two kinds of people. Some watch and they're just really, really arrogant. I mean, the male ego is a special thing, right? And then there's the Israeli, a lot of them don't, they see us as interchangeable, Black people and brown people. So if they agree to come on Al Jazeera, it's for a particular thing. And when they see me, I watch them visibly relax because they haven't done their own homework. And like, oh, it's a Black American, we'll be fine.
Yeah.
And then they relax and they actually say, and that's how they end up back painting themselves into a corner, because they kind of overplay their hands because they're not taking me seriously.
Thank God, because it makes for such a great experience. That guy, David Friedman, the former ambassador who's accused you of Holocaust denial because you asked for evidence of something.
Oh my, that was the one time where even my producer was like, Marc, you're much louder than the guest right now. Please calm down. I was so, and the reason I was so angry, and this is the last thing I'll say. I had just talked to Hussam Zumlet right before from the PLO, but it was off air. But what he said to me, he would talk to me about a cousin of his who was looking out of the window and saw a dog in Gaza that was hungry, and they had no food or anything to give this dog. And the dog had started to pick under the rubble and gnaw on the arm of a child who was under the rubble. And we're like in tears, you know. And then I go from that. And Frank, to be completely transparent, he was partly telling me that because I had pushed him a little bit too hard, I think, about, you know, but Palestinians don't like the PLO. Palestinians don't like the PA. These approval ratings are low. And he's like, why are you asking this question right now in the midst of a genocide? In retrospect, he was right. So going from that to Friedman, who was effectively saying all Palestinians are eligible and worthy of this kind of treatment, that nobody is innocent, that etc., and just frankly lying, I was just enraged and watching him lie and the arrogance, you know, and so little knowledge, you know, it was infuriating. I mean, my blood pressure was through the roof. I actually had to develop new techniques for interviewing these people because I was starting to leave the studio literally like shaking, like out of anger.
Right. Wow. The Zionist coping techniques.
I mean, I need to know what those tips are.
Yeah, seriously.
I mean, maybe I don't anymore because I'm not on Rising, but I mean, that's really, I mean, it's a weird thing to be asked to sort of be like, it didn't feel like there was an emotional symmetry between Robbie and I in terms of what we were forced to kind of carry in our respective investments in this particular issue. And, you know, he doesn't have to be invested in it. And I don't think he really was, even to the extent to which he was my foil. My impression was always that he didn't really care. And like many libertarians just take the position, I don't want the government spending money on anything. That includes money to Israel. I'm not really going to weigh in on the morals and ethics or the legal implications here. But fine, I basically agree with you. I feel like that's kind of Sagar and Crystal's dynamic. Like we don't really have to fight because at the end of the day, we both agree that we shouldn't be funding this war. But Robbie, I think he hasn't said this. He has not said this. My impression was though, that he was being pressured to give me more pushback to make the show sustainable to the higher ups who were upset about what I was saying. So he would go beyond making the, yeah, sure, I'm a libertarian and agree we shouldn't pay for it argument into a like defending war crimes, you know, with the kind of war is war narrative. What do you want? War is war. Things happen in war, you know, that kind of stuff. And, or like, they didn't lie about the rapes. They didn't lie about the 50 beheaded, you know, that kind of stuff. And it feels like to have someone kind of have that casual engagement with the subject area, to be so wrong about it, and then to also be so haughty about it. And for me to be very deeply emotionally invested in it as a moral issue, but also to be factually supported in my description of what's going on, and to have the whole thing then treated like even Stevens was like a lot. That I would have to moderate myself emotionally when I think my emotional response is frankly appropriate, and the other person's emotional response is more about our interpersonal dynamic and not at all related to the horrors that we're seeing and reporting on every day, created a really unsustainable dynamic, especially when I felt like, dude, you don't even care. You don't even really care. Like, you're only doing this. I think in his mind, he's doing it to like keep the show going, because if he doesn't play a good foil, they'll just cancel the whole thing. But that I think was part of the tension that you saw playing out, and why it was exasperating, because it's like, why am I even wasting all this emotional energy on you? You don't even care.
Right.
Sorry, I didn't mean to make you guys my therapist for a second, but
no.
yeah.
As you're saying, I'm feeling it too. I'm like, it's infuriating.
Yeah, and they actually, I remember Robbie, when I did my monologue about Israel being an apartheid state, they were going to run it, I guess, maybe, or before the higher ups told them don't run it. I think they tried to I know they did, because I saw it. Robbie came back in and they had written something for him to say to kind of push back on what I had said. And then, but that wasn't enough. So they were just like, we're just not going to run it. So I think he probably is put in a difficult position where he has to be the face of what they think is acceptable discourse. And, you know, it's funny. What's that? Honest Reporting, that organization, Honest Reporting, ironically named Honest Reporting, which is just harasses people and lies about people all the time. They had done a piece about another thing that I did at the Hill as a guest, not as a host, the article was called "What the Hill." And I think it was that I was accusing Israel of lying about something, maybe about Shireen Abu Akleh. But you can see that the Hill is receptive to these kinds of pressure campaigns. But Marc, I know you have another commitment. Any final words from you? And I hope you'll come back, because this has been so great talking to you.
Always down to come back. And my prior commitment is this 2-year-old who you might hear yelling right now. Well,
I think your 2-year-old is also committed to the liberation of Palestine and very frustrated.
Exactly right. And all this Hasbara right now is just not good for his spirit. No, just I'm glad we're talking about this. And there was a moment where we couldn't have this conversation easily. And now, between independent media, grassroots media, and just the growing consensus of people who have a critique, a legitimate and principled critique of Israel, we're having it, and I'm inspired and excited by that. I'm excited by the fact that people look at that speech from 6 years ago, and people are like, wait, that's what you got fired for? Whereas 6 years ago it was like I set the world on fire. Now it's like, oh, that's all you said? I was hoping for more. You know, that's a good sign. We're getting somewhere, and we're going to win. You know, we're going to be victorious. I believe in a free Palestine. And I think it's going to happen in our life.
From the river to the sea.
From the river to the sea, for sure. Everybody, make sure you check out Night School if you can. It's my nightly YouTube show. We'll be talking about this stuff tonight, and every day we talk about this stuff. We do a daily war on Gaza report. So hopefully people can check it out, and I can't wait to see you all again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marc, and we'll link to that.
Thanks,
we'll link to your show.
Thank you. See you guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So if you saw this live, you were so in luck, because you got to see that whole stream with me and Briahna Joy Gray and Marc Lamont. And if you are watching this later and you want to see the full chat with Briahna Joy Gray and me, you can do that at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. And I really recommend you do that, because we talk about some behind the scenes things that are very entertaining, and also talk about some idiots who are very rude to Brie. And I think we have the last laugh. So again, you can do that at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Thank you so much, Brad. Thank you so much, Tyler. Thank you so much, Phantomus Fanta. And make sure you like the stream. Make sure you become Patreons. Make sure you subscribe, and we will see you next week. Bye, everyone.
Okay, I'm down.